Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Brian's Horror Corner, and welcome to my 31 Days of Halloween horror series. It is day one, October 1st, and so we're going to kick this biatch off the right way with a classic horror movie. And that is a horror movie from 1973, which is known as The Exorcist. And I have the extended director's cut here on Blu ray. So, first time watching this particular Blu-ray, but of course I've seen the movie, I would say 2 to 3 times, although it's been a while since I've watched it before watching it for this review, of course. So let's just go ahead and get started with The Exorcist for day one of my 31 Days of Halloween horror series here, 2022. So obviously, The Exorcist is a 1973 American supernatural horror film directed by William Friedkin and written by William Peter Blatty based on his 1971 novel by the same name. Basically, the movie's about a demonic possession of a young girl and her mother's attempt to rescue her through an exorcism conducted by a pair of Catholic priests. That's sort of the simple premise of the movie. So the movie opens in northern Iraq as we're introduced to a Catholic priest known as Lancaster Marin. He's participating in an archaeological dig which unearths a medallion of Saint Joseph as well as an artifact representing Pazuzu, an ancient demon. So that's how the film opens. And then we're introduced to Chris McNeil, who's an actress, and her daughter Reagan, who lives in a Georgetown, fairly nice house with servants and the like. Um, and yeah, basically, as the movie goes, we're also introduced to another Catholic priest known as Damien Karras, who's visiting his mother, who's very sick in New York. And he has sort of a crisis of faith that kind of ratchets up as the movie goes on. At the same time, Chris's daughter Reagan starts to act weird, and she pisses herself at a party that Chris is throwing. Um, then it just kind of goes on and on. Her bed starts shaking, and Chris starts hearing weird noises in the attic, and ultimately her bed shakes violently, as I said, and um, it just kind of goes from there. So yeah, that's kind of the setup of the movie. The gist of the movie. Cast wise, we have Ellen Burstyn as Chris McNeil, Jason Miller's father slash Doctor Damien Karras, Lee J. Cobb as Lieutenant William Kinderman, Kitty Wynn as Sharon Spencer, Jack McGowan as Burke Dennings, and of course Linda Blair as Reagan McNeil. Oh, and also, of course, Max von Sydow is Father Lancaster Marin. So that's our setup, premise, and cast. Yeah, what can I say about The Exorcist that hasn't been said before? I mean, there's a reason that they call this the scariest horror movie ever made. Whether you think it the scariest film of all time, whether you think it is or not, it's definitely it has to be in the running if you're honest with yourself. And I can only imagine the stories about those in 1973 that watched this movie in the theaters. There's stories of vomiting and fainting and running out of the theater in disgust. And it was a very different time back then, and people weren't as subjected to the kind of horror, the kind of unsettling things that you see in this movie, as most people are nowadays. But even nowadays, I think it holds up pretty well. So let's get into why I think this movie is so classic as a horror movie. And you got to start with the story. When I watched it this time, there's really a lot going on in this movie. It's not just as blanket as an exorcism that takes place, which really sets this movie apart from all the other exorcism movies. You have the introduction in northern Iraq, and then the introduction to the characters, which all it unfolds really well, I think, as well as the story and the buildup of how it all comes together in the third act of this movie. But yeah, really good character introductions and development. Really make the lead up of this movie so much more tension filled, powerful, and ultimately rewarding in the third act, in my opinion. And yeah, just a very well written, well developed, well unfolding story here. It definitely has one of the most insane and scary climaxes to any horror film that I've ever seen. The last 20 to 30 minutes is just really balls to the walls, crazy. Um, as a viewer, you're not quite sure how it's going to turn out. And that's what you want from a filmmaker. It's not predictable, and there's a sense of atmosphere and tension that you're not quite sure how this is going to go at the end of the day. Um, Obviously, this all leads up to the fact this is really a wonderfully directed film, one of the best directed horror movies of all time by William Friedkin. He'd of course would direct other movies, but this is obviously the one he's known best for. Now, from the stories I've heard and from some of the interviews, he wasn't necessarily the best director to work with. He had ways of doing things that weren't necessarily nice, especially as it related to his actors and actresses. He did some things to get a reaction out of him. I think it was a little bit more. I think Hitchcock did that too back in the day. I think it was a little bit more accepted back in the 70s and even before. Obviously, that nowadays it wouldn't fly. But yeah, just some of the methods that he would use. He talked about with Ellen Burstyn as Chris. There's one scene where she has to fly backwards after being slapped by Reagan when she's possessed, and they really pull her on a rope and basically fracture her back as a result. And so just things that he kind of did without telling them. So he wasn't necessarily the best director in terms of, or the nicest director, I should say. But that being said, he does direct a really good movie. How he got there is up for debate, but it's just a very well directed movie. Even though he did some questionable things, as I said, but ultimately he got a very effective and unsettling horror movie, and that's what The Exorcist is at the end of the day. Performances by the entire cast are terrific. You especially have to make mention of Linda Blair, who I believe was 12 when she made this movie. Um, Especially when you watch the behind the scenes, because when the camera was off, she's basically just a typical 12-year-old girl, I guess, very sweet and playful, laughing. And then, boy, when they said action, she turned it on to a very disturbing way to portray this possessed girl. And yeah, she's phenomenal in the film. One of the best horror performances by any young actor or actress that I've seen. Um, but yeah, overall the performances are great. It's clear that the actors really bought into the story and delivered the goods to make it a much scarier movie as a result. There's awesome effects in the movie, both in terms of the practical effects, the action effects like levitating objects flying through the air, as well as some of the practical makeup effects. Most notably, of course, on Linda Blair as Reagan here. You can't really see that too well, but I thought it was very effective, the makeup effects that they used, and definitely added to the scares of the movie. Um, very effective. It's a wonderfully shot movie as well, with great camera and photography work that brings the story to life in a very realistic and grounded way. It was shot very much as a documentary. That's why William Peter Blatty went with William Friedkin, because he wanted sort of more of a documentary director. And this movie definitely feels like has. I mean, it doesn't feel like a documentary, but you can tell it's got that grainy quality that really makes the movie that much scarier and that much more set in realism. Very grounded with that documentary feel. The movie has some of the most iconic moments, visual scenes, and dialogue in any horror movie that's ever been made, or really any movie period, you could say. From the dialogue that the possessed Reagan says, you get some of the lines coming out of a 12-year-old girl. They don't really hold back on to some of the images, even the images of Marin when he shows up at the house and he's dropped off in that old car, and you got the fog in front of the house. And I mean, it's just, well, I mean, it's right here. It's iconic to the lighting, as we see the demon in the background. I mean, just everything about it. It's just phenomenal. Like I said, some of the best horror stuff there. Um, it's much more than a straight possession movie. I think that's the thing that has to be said about this movie. Well, it's obviously a possession movie. There's so many more themes within this movie that show through multiple characters. Much more of a deep horror movie than many we get nowadays, or even back then, actually. It's the ultimate slow burn horror movie, but with the best payoff possible as a result. I think that's the best way that I can sum up The Exorcist. the character of Dr. Damian Karras, or Father Karras, played by Jason Miller. He's kind of the character that we as an audience take this ride with and sort of sympathize with, because he's got a lot going on in his own life with his mom and his a question of faith that he has, which is obviously put to the test at the end of this movie. Um, yeah, just a lot going on in this movie, and as I mentioned before, the atmosphere in the movie overall is very well done, and it almost makes it feel too real, which makes it that much scarier through camera work effects and the grainy documentary shooting style, as I mentioned, that's used here. Very effective. And then finally, the movie's very wonderfully well paced to where we're engaged in this movie. At least I was from the beginning. And it is a slower paced movie. You don't get a lot of horror like the first half hour of the movie necessarily. It really builds and builds, but it builds, like I said, in the best way possible. That when you do get the horror, it's that much more powerful and effective and horrific, quite frankly. So it's a very engaging movie. But yeah, those are my pros. I could probably think of more if I really had to. It's just the only con that I could come up with for this movie is it might be a little bit too much of a slow burn for some people. The first 10 minutes with Father Marin's archaeological search, you could argue wasn't really needed, although I would argue that I could see why it was there and that it was. But it's really about 45 minutes before you get into the possession part of the movie. So for a lot of people that aren't as familiar with it, younger people, people are more familiar with today's kind of movies, horror movies, where they have some kind of horror action right off the bat. They might find it a little slow and boring, not to their satisfaction. That's definitely not the case with me, though. I don't think there's anything boring about it. The only other con that I could really find was Pazuzu. Who exactly Pazuzu was, there's not a lot given. This artifact statue is resurrected during the archaeological search at the beginning of the film, but we don't really know that much about this ancient demon. We're just told that Reagan's possessed by the devil himself. But would have liked to have had a little bit more about Pazuzu, where he came from, what his story was, things like that. But it's nitpicking. I mean, it's really hard to find cons for this movie, in my opinion. The Exorcist, definitely one of the best horror movies, one of the scariest movies. I don't know if I can call it the scariest film of all time. I still have a lot more on my bucket list to watch yet, so I don't want to make that blanket of statement. But it's hard to imagine that it won't be in the running. I can already say it's in the running because there is some very unsettling stuff about this movie, and not in a jump scary kind of way either. So yeah, this movie is as close to a 10 out of 10 as you're going to get. The Exorcist from 1973. Should definitely check it out if you haven't seen it. Buy it, get it on Blu-ray, get the best version of it that you can find. Yeah, I'm going to give this movie a 10 out of 10. I love it. And it's a great way to kick off this 31 Days of Halloween horror series here. So go ahead and comment down below what you guys think of The Exorcist from 1973. Am I blowing too much smoke on it? Do you not like it as much? Do you like it as much? Why not? Comment down below. Make sure to like this video and hit the little notification bell down below so you don't miss any of my upcoming movie reviews for this 31 Days of Halloween horror series. And be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't only miss the rest of this series, but also the great horror content I have coming out the rest of this year and into next year. I have a lot of great stuff planned for you guys. So, yeah, thank you for watching this day one of my 31 Days of Halloween horror series. Stay tuned. We got 30 more days to go, and I hope everybody's doing well, but stay scared. Happy October. Bye.